The morning mist crawled low over Echo Lake, turning the surface into a shifting mirror of silver and ghost light. The rain had stopped sometime after midnight, but everything still glistened. The dock planks, the pine needles, the old red canoe half sunk on the shore. Cal Becker stepped out of his cabin with a thermos of coffee in one hand and a tackle box in the other. Bruno, his 5-year-old German shepherd, was already waiting by the porch steps, tail flicking, ears up, nose working the air like a radar dish. Cal was used to silence. He didn't mind it. After 20 years in the Marines, 3 deployments, 1 divorce, and too many nights spent fixing broken things under fire, he'd earned the quiet. Echo Lake wasn't on any major maps, and that's exactly why he bought the land. 1 old cabin, no neighbors, and a dock that didn't mind creaking at night. No sirens, no orders, just pine trees, water, and Bruno. They walked the usual path down to the edge of the lake. It was half trail, half instinct by now. Bruno darted ahead, nose low, tail wagging slow, checking for deer scat or fresh prints. Cal's boots sank slightly in the damp soil, each step giving off the scent of wet leaves and old bark. "Don't go too far," Cal muttered. Bruno paused, glanced back, and gave a short bark as if to say, "You worry too much." They reached the waterline, where the shoreline had pulled back overnight. Cal noticed it right away. The dock's base posts stood taller than usual, exposed by a good 2 feet. Likely the reservoir had dropped during the storm to prep for the next surge. That wasn't uncommon, but it changed the look of the lake, made it feel barer, more exposed. Cal cast his line from the dock, the spinner sinking with a quiet plunk. He leaned against a post, sipping coffee, eyes on the ripples. The peace of it settled in his chest, right where the ache used to live. Bruno paced nearby, alert but relaxed, nose twitching every few seconds. They stayed like that for 10, maybe 15 minutes. Then Bruno froze. His ears snapped up, head tilted, and then he bolted toward the far end of the muddy shore, paws slapping wet ground, body tense. "Bruno!" Cal called out, setting the thermos down. The dog didn't slow. His bark came sharp, quick, not the playful kind. Not warning either. It was the kind of bark that meant something was wrong. Cal jogged after him, tackle box forgotten. Bruno was standing by a patch of exposed mud about 20 feet from the dock, barking at something on the ground, his front paws dug in, body rigid. Cal approached cautiously, his instincts sharp despite the years. "What is it, boy?" he asked, slowing as he got closer. Then he saw it. A length of chain, thick, heavy, half buried in the mud like a scar across the shore. The kind you didn't see anymore unless you were tying off tugboats or dragging anchors the size of small cars. Cal crouched, brushing back the muck with his gloved hand. The metal was cold, rusted, but not rotted through. Industrial grade. Serious steel. Bruno stopped barking and backed up a step, ears still forward, eyes locked on the chain like it might move. Cal wrapped one hand around a link and gave it a gentle pull. Nothing. He stood, braced his boot against a rock, and yanked harder. The chain resisted, then shifted, just a bit. And from beneath the waterline, a low groan vibrated through the air, metal grinding against something buried. Not a log, not a rock, something else. Cal let go and stepped back, breathing heavier than he realized. Bruno circled the chain once, then sat beside it, not touching, not sniffing, just watching. Cal looked out at the lake. The water had returned to stillness. Not a wave, not a bird in the sky. Even the wind seemed to pause. It was the kind of silence that didn't soothe. It watched. Bruno gave a low rumble in his throat, like something primal had stirred awake. Cal crouched beside him, hand on his fur. The dog didn't blink, just kept staring at the water like it might blink back. He whispered without thinking, What the hell did we just wake up? No answer. Just the chain, rusted and waiting, trailing back into the lake like a tether to something long forgotten. And Bruno, still as stone, guarding it like a secret, had just surfaced. But whatever was listening, it wasn't done yet. The rain had washed the land clean, but the lake had receded further overnight, revealing more than just glistening stones and driftwood. The chain Cal and Bruno had found the day before now stretched longer along the muddy bank, maybe 15 feet of it visible, each link thick as a man's wrist and coated in flaking rust. It lay there like something exhumed, exposed after years of hiding in silence. Cal stood at the edge of the clearing, thermos in hand, boots sinking slightly into the wet soil. Bruno was already down by the water, nose pressed to the ground, sniffing intently along the line of metal. His body was tense, not alert in the usual way, but unsettled. His tail didn't wag. His ears didn't relax. He kept circling the exposed chain like it might come alive. "Something got under your skin, huh?" Cal muttered. Bruno didn't look up. He paused only to glance toward the lake, then back at the end of the chain, which vanished into the shallows like a secret being slowly unraveled. Cal took another sip of coffee. The metallic smell was stronger today, layered with something sharper. Oil, maybe. Not just rust. He knelt by the chain again, brushed away a thick clot of mud with his glove, and saw more links leading straight into the lake. The water itself was strangely calm, almost sticky-looking, like it held weight just beneath the surface. His gut told him not to leave it alone. He walked back to the cabin, returned 10 minutes later with his old toolbox, a rope pulley system, and a weathered length of steel cable. The winch was homemade, rigged from parts he'd salvaged off, an ATV hoist and bolted to a cross-beam of treated pine. He'd used it once to pull a sunken log from the cove. It should hold. Bruno watched silently from the shade of a pine tree, still uneasy but keeping close. His eyes never left the chain. Cal anchored the pulley to a sturdy root and looped the cable around the end link. He leaned into the crank slowly, testing resistance. At first, nothing happened. The line went taut. The chain didn't budge. But then, it moved. A groan sounded from beneath the water, deep, mechanical, like metal shifting against rock. Bruno let out a low growl, took 2 steps back, then froze, tail stiff, ears up. Cal felt the vibration through the crank handle and into his chest, subtle but real. Something heavy was giving way beneath the lake bed. He kept turning. Link by link, the chain surfaced. Water ran off the rusted metal in long streams. The smell got worse, a mix of old fuel and wet iron. The cable whined under the tension. Cal planted his feet and pulled again. Then the surface of the lake broke. At first it was just a ripple, then bubbles. Then a hard edge rose up through the water, covered in algae, framed in decades of lake grime. It was a corner, square, reinforced steel, pitted from years underwater but intact. The rest followed like something being lifted from a grave. It wasn't a boat, it was a door, not one meant for people to walk through, but to lock something in. A rectangular hatch, with heavy bolts welded along the sides and metal crossbeams reinforced in thick layers. Cal stared as the shape emerged more fully, thick water sloshing off its top, pooling into the mud below. It looked like a section of a vault, the kind built into the ground, or under it. Bruno stood still now, eyes wide, body tense. He took one cautious step forward, then stopped again, ears twitching. Cal walked closer, reached out, and ran his glove along the cold surface. The steel felt strangely warm, as if it had stored the weight of history and was now exhaling it. There was text stamped along the upper edge, barely visible through the rust, but still legible. U.S. Civil Defense Property. Cal's heart skipped. He stepped back, breath catching slightly in his throat. Civil defense. That was Cold War talk. Fallout shelters, test bunkers, contingency plans. He'd heard of them, even toured one years ago as a kid. But those were always above ground. Concrete rooms with old rations and yellow signs. Nothing like this. Nothing this far out. Nothing under a lake. He looked at Bruno, who let out a short, nervous huff. The dog padded toward him and sat down, placing himself between Cal and the water's edge, as if to remind him where the line was drawn. This wasn't supposed to be found. Cal whispered. He pulled out his phone, stepped back, and took a series of photos. Close-ups of the text, the hinges, the chain, the weld seams. His fingers trembled slightly. He didn't want to overreact, but this didn't feel like some abandoned utility project. It felt buried. He attached the photos to an email and sent them to the county engineering office with a short message. Found submerged structure attached to industrial chain. Lake Echo, northwest shore. Please advise. He hit send, but even as he stood there, wind brushing the trees, the lake settling again into its unnatural quiet, Cal knew the truth. Whatever this thing was, it had been meant to stay hidden. And somehow, he and Bruno had become the ones to disturb it. The hatch lay half submerged, its edges catching the noon sun. The rust shimmered faintly in the light. Bruno didn't move. He just stared at the water. Like he knew something down there had started listening. The response came faster than Cal expected. Less than 24 hours after he sent the photos and coordinates, a government-marked white truck rumbled down the gravel road toward his cabin. He was standing near the dock when the vehicle pulled up. Bruno, already at his side, tensed but didn't bark. He simply stood, tail low, eyes fixed on the newcomers as if already assessing the situation. 3 people stepped out. 2 wore blue windbreakers, stamped with the State Engineering Department insignia. The third, taller and older, had a clipboard under his arm and a sonar scanner slung over his shoulder. "You Cal Becker?" the man asked, extending a hand. "That's me," Cal said, shaking it. "You the ones who got my message?" "Name's Aaron Shaw, senior structural engineer. This is Monica and Curtis. Mind if we take a look?" Cal stepped aside. "It's down by the shore. Just follow the dog." Bruno led the way, not out of obedience, but certainty. He moved like he already knew the route would matter. When they reached the hatch, the reaction was immediate. Monica stopped short, eyes widening. Curtis let out a low whistle and crouched to examine the rusted text. Aaron knelt next to the exposed structure, brushing a gloved hand across the pitted steel. His eyes narrowed. "This isn't from any recent civil works project," he said quietly. "This is old, real old, pre-1970s for sure." Cal nodded. "That's what I thought. Chain's industrial grade. The welds are thick, reinforced." "And the stamp?" Monica added, pointing to the barely legible letters on the side. They leaned in closer. Cal had scrubbed part of it clean earlier with a wire brush. The text now showed more clearly. FSL2A19. Aaron exhaled slowly. "Never seen that code, but the style looks military, maybe civil defense." Curtis glanced up from the hatch. "Could be a Cold War era bunker. Fallout shelter, maybe?" "But there aren't any mapped shelters in this area," Monica said. "Nothing under Echo Lake. It's not even zoned for it." Aaron stood, pulling out his clipboard. "Then we need a scan." They set up quickly. The sonar unit was portable, about the size of a suitcase, and paired with a rugged tablet. Curtis inflated a small raft and launched it into the shallows. Aaron took the controls while Monica monitored the feed. Cal stood beside them, arms crossed, Bruno lying at his feet, but watching the lake like it owed him an answer. The screen began to populate with outlines and waveforms. At first it was static, Then a clear shape appeared. Rectangular, large, about 30 feet offshore, 10 feet wide, 12 feet long, buried beneath layers of silt. "There it is," Aaron murmured. "That's not natural." Cal stepped closer. "Looks like a chamber." Curtis adjusted the frequency. More detail emerged. Smooth walls, a solid roof, straight lines. Not a rock formation, not debris. "A sealed unit," Monica confirmed. "And it's not aligned with the water intake infrastructure from the dam. It's off-grid." "Which makes no sense," Aaron said. "If it were a legitimate shelter, it'd be recorded in the flood planning documents." Cal stayed quiet, but his eyes didn't leave the screen. He could feel the shift happening. Not just in the mud, in the air, in the narrative. This wasn't a curiosity anymore. It was a secret. Aaron finally said it out loud. Maybe it was part of an experimental program, one of those Cold War contingencies, off-the-books shelters, pre-positioned sites. They built a lot of them during the 50s, especially out west. "And just left them?" Cal asked. "Some were sealed, others decommissioned. But if this one's still down there..." "Sealed..." He didn't finish the sentence. Bruno gave a short bark, low and insistent, then stood up and moved to the water's edge. His ears were forward, body tense again. Cal followed the dog's gaze. The water, now calm, rippled slightly. Not from wind, not from fish. It was the kind of movement that came from below. "There's more," Aaron said, checking a secondary scan. "Something inside the structure. It's hollow, possibly stocked." "Stocked with what?" Cal asked. "Whatever they left behind," Monica said. "Or whoever." A beat of silence passed. Then Aaron spoke again, quieter this time. "Maybe this was one of the sites abandoned when the dam was built. The valley was flooded fast in the 50s. Whole sections of land disappeared underwater in a few weeks." Monica looked up. "There were protests back then. People complained about early flooding. Could be this got missed." Aaron stared at the lake, then back at the hatch. His voice dropped. "If this was a shelter left behind, who was in it when the water came?" No one spoke. The only sound was the faint lap of water against the chain. Bruno didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on the lake, unblinking, like he was waiting for something to rise. They returned at first light. The engineering team had brought more gear this time: oxygen tanks, cutting equipment, waterproof lights, and a pair of divers from the State Emergency Response Unit. The air smelled of diesel and dew, and the lake looked flat as a mirror, still holding its secrets beneath. Cal stood near the tree line, Bruno at his side, ears pricked, posture tense. The dog hadn't relaxed since yesterday. Aaron Shaw, the lead engineer, gave final instructions near the edge of the dock. "We cut the hatch only if the welds respond cleanly. No stress on the seal. We document everything. Understood?" The divers nodded, pulling on their hoods. Cal watched them descend into the water with a soundless grace, bubbles trailing behind like a slow breath. The cables stretched taut from the raft to the pulley on shore. Bruno let out a low whine and took a step forward. "Easy," Cal said, kneeling to grab his collar. "We're not the ones going under." Bruno didn't break his stare. The radios crackled faintly as the divers made contact. "We're in position. Welds are intact but show age fatigue. Beginning torch cut." The plasma torch lit up underwater like a silent flare. It was beautiful in a strange way. Ghostly blue light dancing beneath the surface, reflecting off the ripples, warping with every current. Cal felt the heat in his chest before the metal ever gave way. Not fear exactly. Something older, like memory pushing to the front. He found himself thinking of Iraq, the compound near Fallujah, nighttime breaches, wielding tools meant for war, cutting into places that weren't supposed to be opened. His breathing slowed, involuntarily. Bruno barked sharply. The sound broke through the lake's stillness like a shot. Everyone turned. The dog was pulling against Cal's grip now, growling deep, frantic, hackles up. "I've never seen him like this," Cal muttered, tightening his hold. From the radio's static fizzed. Then, "Doors coming loose, water's pulling in fast." A dull vibration rippled through the earth. The lake surged slightly as if exhaling. Mud curled up from the depths, clouding the surface in black plumes. A soft whoomp echoed through the air like the settling of something massive. Then came silence. Aaron leaned toward the radio. "What's your visual?" No response for 5 seconds. Then, "We're inside." Cal stood now, Bruno circling his legs, agitated. He could hear it in the diver's voice, a tremor, barely masked. "There's a room, intact, no breach. Looks like it was sealed before the flooding." "Describe it." "Single chamber, metal cases on shelves. There's a hand-crank radio, Geiger counter, supplies in vacuum tins, fallout shelter signage on the wall. We're taking video." Bruno barked again, his eyes locked on the exact spot where the chain disappeared into the lake. Aaron muttered, half to himself, 70 years sealed in mud, and everything still in place. Cal spoke quietly. "What about people?" The answer came slower this time. No remains visible, no bodies, just everything else, like they packed up and stepped out for lunch. The surface stilled. Again. Cal stared at it. Somehow that answer chilled him more than if they'd found skeletons. He glanced down at Bruno, who sat now, body coiled but still, staring at the rippling lake like it had just whispered his name. Aaron pulled out the monitor and showed Cal a still frame the divers had transmitted. Inside the chamber, 6 helmets lined on a wall hook, a chalkboard with faded writing, sealed crates labeled CD emergency rations, and in the center, a small table, untouched, with a notepad curled at the edges from moisture. But no people. "Looks like they just left," Aaron said. Cal stared at the image. "No," he replied. "Looks like they never got the chance." The hatch, now open, lay like a scar across the lake's edge, breathing for the first time in decades. Bruno gave one last bark, quieter this time, as if he, too, knew that something old had just been pulled from the dark, and it wasn't ready to be forgotten. The air was drier the morning the historians arrived. 3 SUVs pulled up just after dawn, crunching over the gravel near Cal's cabin. Bruno was already standing on the porch, ears forward, tail still. Cal didn't need to be told they weren't tourists. These people moved like they were walking into a place sacred and dangerous all at once. Aaron Shaw greeted them first, clipboard in hand, already briefing them before their boots hit the soil. Cal watched from the edge of the dock, thermos of coffee in one hand, Bruno pressed close to his leg. The dog didn't growl, didn't move, just stared, like always, at the lake. The first to approach was a slender woman in her early 50s, her grey-streaked braid tucked neatly into the collar of a canvas field jacket. She introduced herself as Dr. Helen DeWitt, military historian from the University of Colorado. With her was a wiry man with horn-rimmed glasses, Daniel Yates, local archivist, and a younger journalist from Helena named Cam Rhodes, notebook already in hand. They gathered under a makeshift canopy beside the hatch, now fully exposed and cordoned off. The lake lapped at the edges quietly, as if trying to reclaim what had been taken. "Tell me again how this was found," Dr. DeWitt asked, flipping through a binder stuffed with old aerial maps and grainy photographs. Cal nodded toward Bruno. "He found the chain. I just pulled it." Cam looked up from scribbling. "That's a hell of a quote." Daniel was already comparing notes, fingers moving fast across laminated maps. He stopped, tapping a page. "Here, 1954, Project A-19. It's listed as a Cold War prototype site. Civil defense classification, likely a fallout shelter trial model. Aaron leaned in. It wasn't on any official maps we pulled. That's because it was stricken from the record, DeWitt replied. The next mention is from a flood control report. Same year. No follow-up, no closure confirmation, just a note. Structure sealed. Monica from the engineering team walked over with a new find, a set of microfilm scans from state archives. Daniel slid them onto a portable light box. The image flickered into view. A typed project log, dated June 1954. Contractors assigned, Daniel read aloud. 6 names: welders, riggers, foremen. Estimated completion, June 9th. Site inspection scheduled for the 12th. He flipped to the next frame. No further entries. Cal frowned. What happened on the 10th? DeWitt looked at the others, then pulled another folder from her satchel. That's the part we're trying to confirm. The Army Corps of Engineers initiated early water diversion that week. It was 2 days ahead of schedule. Monica stiffened. You're saying the dam flooded the valley while these men were still working? Daniel's voice was quiet now. There's no evacuation record, no payroll termination, and none of the 6 names appear in any civil records after that summer. No deaths reported, no transfers, no obituaries. It's like they vanished. Bruno gave a low growl, soft but present. Cal instinctively placed a hand on his head, grounding them both. They were down there, Cam said, almost to himself. Trapped before anyone realized what they were standing on. Aaron's expression darkened. We still haven't found any remains. That doesn't mean they weren't inside. DeWitt stepped back, hands in her jacket pockets, eyes scanning the hatch. If the flood came early, they may have had no warning, she said. Or worse, they were told to seal the shelter as part of protocol and waited for a rescue that never came. Cal felt a slow pressure building in his chest. He imagined 6 men underground, tools in hand, maybe eating lunch, maybe listening to a crackling radio, the sound of water rising above their heads. They built something to save others, he said quietly, and it buried them instead. No one spoke for a moment. Then Daniel, still bent over the logbook, muttered without looking up. Clerical casualties. DeWitt turned toward him. Excuse me? That's what we called it during archival reviews. People who died not from war or disaster, but from paperwork, a missed line, a date not updated, a call never made. He looked up, pale behind his glasses. They died because someone didn't double-check a file. Bruno stood up suddenly and walked to the edge of the dock, his eyes fixed on the ripples moving out from the hatch. His ears twitched once, then settled forward. Cal followed his gaze. The lake was quiet, but not still. The weather turned colder as the search deepened. A damp wind blew across Echo Lake, pushing fog low across the water and brushing pine needles from the trees in soft, steady flurries. The hatch remained exposed, its rusted edge like a wound in the shoreline. Below it, divers rotated in and out of the water, each returning with more fragments of a time long buried. On the 4th morning of expanded excavation, a diver named Holt surfaced clutching something tightly in his gloved hands. His expression was unreadable as he climbed onto the dock, water streaming from his suit. The object was passed to Aaron Shaw, then to Dr. DeWitt, who handled it like an artifact from a crypt. A metal box, small, scuffed but intact, sealed with a rubber gasket and corroded latches. Military grade. Someone had meant for it to last. Cal stood a few feet away with Bruno, who was visibly unsettled. His ears were down, but his eyes never left the box. His tail gave one slow, uncertain thump against Cal's boot, like it was tapping for something deeper than attention. They brought the box under the canopy and laid it on a field table. No ceremony. just the cold knowledge that what was inside might turn theory into truth. Daniel Yates unlatched it carefully, his breath shallow. The lid gave a soft hiss as it came free, breaking a seal that had held for decades. Inside was a plastic-wrapped bundle of documents, a notepad, a black-and-white photograph curled at the edges, and underneath it all, a zippered pouch marked personal. DeWitt reached for the photo first. She unrolled it gently on the table. 6 men, standing shoulder to shoulder, covered in dust and sweat, grinning wide. They were mid-construction, steel beams behind them, one man with a welding torch slung over his shoulder. "Must have been taken just days before," she whispered. No names were written, no dates, just faces. Real, tangible, laughing in a moment, frozen in time. Aaron opened the pouch next. Inside were fragments of a journal, pages torn from a field notebook, the ink smudged but still legible in parts. He read aloud, voice quiet but clear. June 10th. Generator tested. Main seal holding. Food stocks counted again. Waiting on inspector. He flipped to the next. June 11th. No word from above. Radio static. Water levels outside rising. Not sure why. And then the last page. It wasn't written like the others. No date. Just words scratched hastily, uneven, likely in the dark. They never came back. Water's rising. We're sealing it ourselves. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to still for a breath. DeWitt stepped away, her hand pressed to her mouth. Daniel leaned back, glasses fogging slightly. Aaron stood with the journal page in hand, motionless. Cal said nothing. He simply reached for the photograph, held it up and stared. Bruno pressed against his leg. They didn't just get trapped. Cal said softly. They made a choice. Aaron turned to him. What do you mean? They weren't buried by accident. They sealed it, from the inside. Hoped someone would come. And when no one did, they made peace with that. DeWitt nodded slowly. Maybe they thought the shelter could float, or hold out long enough for help. But the dam filled too fast. Monica added. There was no rescue plan, just silence. Cal traced the edge of the photo with his thumb. The men in the image looked like people he might have served with. Ordinary guys, calloused hands, big laughs, hope in their eyes, the kind who built things believing they'd last. They weren't forgotten, Daniel said, but his voice sounded uncertain. Not anymore. Cal didn't answer. He stood alone for a moment, holding the picture, Bruno at his side. 6 men. A moment of joy. A room that became a tomb not through violence, but neglect. The lake shifted slightly in the breeze, its surface glinting like old steel. And Cal just stood there, staring at the photo like it might speak first. The granite stone stood quiet by the lake, sunk half a foot into the damp earth, grey against the green of the pines. Its surface was smooth but unpolished, as if it had already weathered time. There were no names etched into it, because there were none to give. Just a single line, centered and carved deep, to those whose names were washed away by time. The state had moved quickly after the discovery was confirmed. Within 2 weeks, the governor's office approved funding for a memorial. There would be no forensic recovery, too much time had passed, and the risks to the integrity of the shelter were too high. But the evidence was clear. The journal, the photo, the truth, finally risen from the lake's silence. And now, there was this. On a Saturday morning, with the wind carrying the scent of pine and distant wood smoke, the small crowd gathered. Veterans in uniform stood at quiet attention. Local teachers brought their students. Families from nearby towns parked along the gravel road, unsure if they were supposed to bring flowers or simply stand and listen. Cal didn't join them. He remained on the ridge above the lake, at the edge of the tree line. Bruno sat beside him, head up, tail brushing the ground in slow rhythm. Neither moved as the ceremony began. Below, Aaron stood behind a simple wooden podium, voice steady as he recounted the story. How 6 men built a shelter designed to protect, only to be entombed by bureaucracy and neglect. How their message had waited beneath the water for 70 years. How a rusted chain, a dog's instinct, and a quiet veteran had pulled history back into the light. Applause was brief and respectful. The American flag was folded and handed to a representative from the Civil Defense Historical Society. A group of high school students sang "Amazing Grace," off-key, but sincerely. A bugler played taps. Silence followed. Then, one by one, people approached the stone. A boy placed a pine cone at its base. An elderly woman knelt, her trembling hand resting on the carved words. A former Marine in dress blues saluted with eyes closed. Cal said nothing. He only lowered his hand to rest on Bruno's head. The dog leaned into it slightly, eyes on the lake. He hadn't barked once all morning. He didn't need to. Cal took a deep breath, letting the air fill his chest, then settle. Remembered the last page of the journal, the handwriting jagged and soaked with time. They never came back. Water's rising. We're sealing it ourselves. He remembered the photo. 6 men, laughing in the half-shadow of welded beams. Not heroes, not soldiers, just workers doing a job, believing someone would be back. They weren't buried by nature. They weren't lost in war. They were forgotten by a file folder, by a missed call, by a clock that moved too fast. Someone had made a decision without knowing what it cost. Down by the water, Daniel Yates stepped forward to say a final word. He didn't read from notes. He just looked out over the crowd and said softly, "They didn't die in war. They just vanished because no one double-checked a list." The words hung in the air like fog, curling over the lake, drifting towards the trees. Cal closed his eyes for a moment. Beside him, Bruno gave a quiet, low exhale. The kind that said, "It's done now." And for the first time since that chain groaned beneath the surface, Cal believed him. The headlines faded, just as Cal knew they would. A month passed since the memorial. The news vans packed up. The historians filed their reports. The governor sent a letter of thanks. Then the world moved on. As it always did. But the lake stayed. Each morning, just after sunrise, Cal walked the shoreline with Bruno. Same boots, same rhythm, same quiet ritual of checking dock posts, tightening old rope, replacing planks that had warped or cracked in the night chill. The waterline had risen slightly with the spring thaw, but the surface remained still, almost reverent. Bruno trotted ahead, nose skimming low, occasionally pausing to sniff where fish had stirred or raccoons had passed in the dark. He no longer barked at the lake, but he never turned his back on it either. Back at the cabin, the days moved slowly. Coffee in the morning, repairs in the afternoon, radio murmurs when he remembered to switch it on. Nights came quiet, broken only by the creak of wood and the wind whispering through the trees. On the porch, just above the steps, Cal had mounted a small piece of the chain. He'd cut it from the length that had first surfaced weeks ago, cleaned it, scrubbed away the lake scum and sediment. But he hadn't polished it to shine. He left the red-orange rust in place, just beneath a protective coat of oil. It looked like blood that had dried long ago, but hadn't been forgotten. A wound sealed, not erased. Visitors still came from time to time. A schoolteacher from town brought a class one weekend to visit the memorial. A retired welder who'd known one of the men on the contractor list left a can of beer by the stone and walked away without a word. A mother and daughter brought flowers. No cameras, no fanfare. They didn't knock on Cal's door, and he didn't mind. Some places weren't meant for words. One foggy morning, as Cal sanded a loose railing on the dock, Bruno barked. Not loud, not urgent, just one low sound. Cal looked up. A young man stood at the tree line. Late 20s, maybe. Backpack, hiking boots, tired eyes. He raised a hand awkwardly. "Sorry," he said. "Didn't mean to startle." Cal stood, wiped his hands on his jeans. "You looking for the memorial?" The man nodded. "Yeah, my grandfather worked in dam logistics. Never talked about it. I think he might have known what happened, or suspected." Cal motioned toward the trail. "It's just down that path. You'll see the marker. You won't miss it." The man hesitated. "Did you really find it by accident?" Cal glanced at Bruno, who sat patiently, watching the stranger. "No," Cal said. "He did." The man looked at Bruno, then back at Cal. "Thank you." Cal didn't answer, just returned to his railing. Later, as the sun broke through the fog, Cal sat on the porch, coffee in hand. Bruno rested beside him, head on his front paws, tail brushing lightly against the boards. The chain above them caught the light just right, casting a faint shadow that looked like a line, a tether to something deeper. Cal sipped slowly, gaze drifting towards the lake. He thought of the 6 men, of the photo, the journal, the silence that nearly kept it all hidden. People talk about what's buried. Bodies, secrets, truths. But as he sat there, one hand resting on Bruno's thick fur, Cal knew something else. The scariest thing isn't what's buried. It's what we forget to remember. By the 2nd month, the story had drifted beyond the borders of Wyoming. A Sunday feature in the Montana Chronicle ran the headline, "The Dog Who Found a Bunker." Below it, a full-page photo of Bruno sitting beside the rusted hatch, his ears forward, eyes locked on the lake. Cal stood in the background, half-shadowed, one hand on his dog's back. They had sent a reporter the week before, a quiet woman named Joanna with a notebook full of real questions and a tape recorder she rarely used. She didn't ask for drama. She wanted the human parts, the waiting, the chain, the silence, the choice to keep pulling. She asked Cal if he'd give a statement. He hesitated. "I didn't discover it," he finally said, his voice low. "Bruno did. I just pulled up what time forgot." That quote ran beneath the photo. By Monday, it was trending. Bruno became something of a local legend. Elementary school kids sent hand-drawn pictures to the ranger station. Bruno with a cape, Bruno on a boat, Bruno barking at ghosts. A 3rd-grade class in Casper held a mock history fair. One girl dressed up as a Cold War engineer and explained fallout shelters using the story of Echo Lake. Bruno didn't know any of this, of course, but Cal noticed he got more head pats at the gas station. Someone left a rawhide bone outside the cabin gate with a note. For the quiet hero. Cal tucked it in Bruno's storage bin and didn't tell anyone. More letters came. From veterans, from teachers, from people who had lost family in construction jobs with no names carved in stone. One from a man in Ohio whose uncle had vanished in 1954 after a job out west. Maybe he was one of them, the letter said. If so, thank your dog for giving him back. The town council invited Cal to speak at a civic event. He declined. But he did send a note. One line, handwritten. Some truths don't need speeches, they just need someone to stop walking past them. Still, change followed. The state archived the Echo Lake discovery under its Cold War Projects initiative. A high school history teacher began drafting a curriculum unit titled Forgotten America. A documentary crew reached out, but Cal didn't answer the email. What mattered to him stayed closer to the ground. On the cabin porch, the chain still hung. He'd installed a small wooden plaque beneath it. It didn't say much, just a date. And below that, found, remembered. One afternoon, a military historian from D.C. named Marcus Bell visited the lake. He didn't come with press or permits, just an old briefcase, a worn jacket, and a look in his eye like he'd spent too many years in archives and not enough near water. He and Cal walked the shoreline in silence. Bruno led them without being asked. When they reached the hatch site, now closed and sealed again, Bell stood for a long time without speaking. Then he crouched beside the marker, running a hand across the granite. "They didn't get medals?" he said. "Didn't even get initials?" Cal said nothing. Bell turned to him. "But they got remembered. That's rarer than we admit." He stood, brushing his hands. "You didn't just find steel and mud, Mr. Becker. You found a piece of this country we buried so deep we forgot it existed." Cal looked toward the lake. The sun was beginning to drop behind the ridge, streaking the water in bronze and shadow. "It was never mine to keep," he said. Bruno gave a soft chuff, leaning into Cal's leg like punctuation. Bell smiled. "No, but you gave it back. That matters more." The breeze stirred the pines again, and somewhere across the still water, the faint clink of the wind brushing against the hanging chain echoed like a memory remembered just in time. Late afternoon pressed soft gold across the trees, the kind of light that didn't demand attention, just offered quiet company. Cal sat on the porch of the cabin, legs stretched out, coffee warm in his hands. The wood beneath him creaked every so often, not from his movement but from age and air, the sound of a place alive in its stillness. Bruno lay across his boots, chin resting on his paws, chest rising slow and steady. His ears weren't asleep. They never were. Even now, months later, the dog still turned his head at the faintest sound. Wind through pine needles, a distant loon, the settling of water along the rocks. The chain still hung on its post near the stairs. A dull red rust ran along one side, held in place with a coat of oil and memory. It caught the fading light now like it had caught time, quietly, without permission, but completely. Inside the cabin, the radio crackled to life. Cal had forgotten it was still set to the public station. A familiar voice hummed through the static, smooth and low, like someone reading from a story that mattered. "Tonight," the host said, "we honor a veteran and his dog. Not for fighting a war, but for remembering one." Cal didn't move. He just reached down and ran his hand slowly over the top of Bruno's head, fingers threading through the thick fur behind the ears. The dog's tail tapped once. "Still guarding, huh, boy?" Cal murmured. Bruno didn't lift his head. He didn't need to. The lake, beyond the porch rail, shimmered in the dying light. Somewhere beneath its mirrored surface, the shelter remained. Sealed. A chamber-turned time capsule. A story saved by instinct and stubbornness, and the simple truth that sometimes you have to look twice at the things most people pass by. Cal thought of the 6 men, of the journal, the last sentence. They never came back. And of Bruno, standing over that rusted chain when no one else had noticed, barking not for danger, but for something waiting to be remembered. Cal leaned back and let the silence return. But it wasn't empty. It was full of echoes, of breath, of things that hadn't been said, but were felt all the same. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, the radio voice continued. "They didn't bark for food. They barked for what we forgot to hear." Cal smiled faintly, not at the words, but at how right they felt. Bruno shifted his weight, pressing closer to Cal's boot, his body warm against the fading chill. And beneath the porch, the chain swayed just slightly in the breeze, just enough to remind them it was still there, still hanging, still guarding. He didn't bark for food. He barked for what we forgot to hear. What's your story with a loyal pet? If this story moved you, share it with someone who understands. And if you believe dogs like Bruno deserve to be remembered, follow our channel, support the stories, and keep the memory alive. This is German Shepherd, where loyalty speaks louder than words.